In the vast darkness between stars, where ancient civilizations rise and fall like waves upon cosmic shores, there exists a universal truth that every species learns too late. When you corner a predator, when you push them to the brink of extinction, when you force them to evolve beyond their natural limits, you create something far more dangerous than what you initially feared. The Galactic Council had spent 3 centuries systematically hunting humanity across the void, believing them to be nothing more than primitive warmongers who threatened the peace of civilized space. They had blasted Earth's colonies, scattered human refugees to the furthest reaches of known space, and declared victory over what they called the Terran plague. But they had made one critical error in their calculations. They had never actually killed all the humans. And now, as alien worlds burned under an unknown threat that consumed entire star systems, as panic spread through the greatest military powers the galaxy had ever known, as proud alien civilizations found themselves helpless against an enemy that seemed to emerge from the very fabric of space itself, they would learn what happens when you force humanity to become something more than human. The distress calls echoing across subspace all carried the same desperate message. Anyone, please, we need help. Our worlds are dying. Our people are being consumed by shadows that move through walls, that phase through our strongest defenses. Nothing we have can stop them. Please, if anyone can hear this. What they didn't know was that someone was listening, someone who had spent 300 years in the spaces between dimensions, learning to hunt in ways that made ancient nightmares seem like children's stories. The Terran Marines were coming, and this time they weren't coming as refugees or diplomats or even as conquerors. They were coming as something the galaxy had never seen before and something it would never forget. The emergency beacon screamed across the void with the kind of desperation that made even hardened military commanders pause at their tactical displays. Admiral Zeph Kerr of the Vorthak Hegemony stood rigid before the central hologram in his flagship's command center, his 4 eyes fixed on the cascading streams of distress signals flowing in from across 3 sectors. "Report!" he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never known defeat in 40 years of military service. Lieutenant Yekse, her chitinous hands trembling as she worked her console, looked up with barely concealed fear. "Sir, we've lost contact with 17 colony worlds in the past standard day. The last transmission from Kepler, 442, showed." She paused, her secondary breathing apertures fluttering with anxiety. "Sir, the entire planetary defense grid was torn apart. Not destroyed, torn apart. Like something reached through their shields and pulled their stations into pieces." Zefkar's mandibles clicked in thought. The Vorthak had ruled this sector for over 2 millennia. Their technology was among the most advanced in the known galaxy, their military doctrine refined through countless conflicts with lesser species. Nothing should have been able to penetrate their defenses so completely. What about the hegemony's other member species, the Quellian Collective? The Mordani Trade Consortium? All reporting similar losses, sir. The Quellians lost their entire 4th Fleet 3 days ago. The Mordani. Yekse's voice broke slightly. The Mordani homeworld went dark yesterday. 15 billion souls, sir. Just gone. The bridge fell silent except for the soft hum of life support systems and the constant chatter of distress signals. Zefkar had fought in the Great Purge 3 centuries ago, when the Galactic Council had united to drive the human menace from civilized space. He remembered the satisfaction of watching Earth's colonies burn, the relief when the last human refugee ships had fled beyond the galactic rim. They had congratulated themselves on eliminating a threat to galactic peace. Now something else was hunting them, something that moved through space like a living shadow and consumed entire worlds without leaving so much as debris behind. "Sir," another officer called from the communication station, "we're receiving a priority transmission from the Council chamber on Nexus Prime. Put it through." The hologram shifted, revealing the familiar amphitheater where representatives of 97 different species gathered to govern the galaxy. But instead of the usual ordered assembly, chaos reigned. Delegates screamed at each other in dozens of languages, while emergency klaxons wailed in the background. "This is Councillor Prime Veltar," came a voice heavy with exhaustion and fear. "All fleet commanders, all military assets, all defensive installations, we are implementing Emergency Protocol 7. The enemy has reached the core worlds. Nexus Prime is under direct assault." The transmission cut to external views of the Council's capital world. Zefkar's blood ran cold as he watched massive structures that had stood for millennia simply vanish into writhing darkness. Ships fled in every direction, while something that defied visual comprehension moved across the planet's surface like a living storm. Admiral HFY whispered, "Long-range sensors are detecting massive gravitational distortions moving toward our position. Whatever destroyed those worlds, it's coming here." Xenos closed his 4 eyes and tried to process what he was seeing. In all his years of military service, through dozens of campaigns against rebel species and resource wars with rival governments, he had never encountered anything that operated like this. Their enemy didn't use conventional weapons or recognizable technology. It simply consumed. Planets, ships, entire star systems disappeared into some kind of interdimensional void, leaving nothing behind but empty space. "Set course for the Refuge Nebula," he ordered. "Signal all remaining hegemony forces to fall back to Rally Point 7. "Sir, what about the colonies? What about our people?" Xenos looked at his young lieutenant with the weight of his species' survival pressing down on his shoulders. "There's nothing we can do for them now. Our priority is preserving what remains of our civilization." As the hegemony fleet began its retreat, Xenos couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something crucial. The enemy's patterns of attack, the way they moved through space, the complete inability of any known technology to even detect them until it was too late, it all felt familiar somehow. 3 days into their flight toward the Refuge Nebula, Xenos' worst fears were confirmed when Scout Commander Thelvan burst onto the bridge with a datapad clutched in her claws. "Admiral, you need to see this immediately. Our deep space monitors picked up something during the attack on Kepler 442. She activated a holographic display showing grainy footage from a long-range sensor drone. At first, Xenos saw only the familiar writhing darkness that had consumed so many worlds. But as Thelvan enhanced the image and slowed the playback, something else became visible. "There," she pointed with a trembling claw. "Look at the edge of the distortion field." Xenos leaned forward, his eyes straining to make sense of what he was seeing. For just a moment, as the darkness shifted and flowed across the planet's surface, he caught a glimpse of something that made his blood freeze in his veins. Movement. Purposeful, controlled movement within the shadow, and for just an instant, the silhouette of something bipedal, something that walked upright on 2 legs and carried what looked like weapons. "Run spectral analysis," he commanded, his voice barely above a whisper. The computer processed the data for several long minutes before displaying its results. Thelvan read the findings with growing horror. DNA traces detected. Carbon-based bipedal physiology. Neural activity patterns consistent with... Say it, Xenos ordered. "With human classification, sir. But that's impossible. We destroyed them centuries ago. We watched their homeworlds burn. There were no survivors beyond the rim." Xenos stared at the data display, memories of the Great Purge flooding back. The humans had been dangerous, yes, but they had been primitive. Their technology had been centuries behind galactic standard. They had possessed no faster-than-light communication, no energy shields, no antimatter weapons. They had been confined to slow chemical rockets and kinetic projectiles. But what if their exile beyond the galactic rim hadn't been their end? What if it had been their transformation? "Get me everything we have on human psychology and military doctrine from the Council archives," he commanded, "and send a priority message to all surviving hegemony ships. Tell them we may have identified our enemy." As his crew scrambled to comply, Xenos found himself remembering fragments from the human wars. Their refusal to surrender even when faced with impossible odds. Their ability to adapt and innovate under pressure. Their disturbing tendency to treat warfare not as a necessary evil, but as an art form to be perfected. The galaxy had spent 3 centuries congratulating itself on eliminating the human threat. But what if all they had really done was force humanity to evolve beyond the constraints of conventional space and time? What if the shadows now consuming entire star systems weren't some unknown alien menace, but something far more terrifying? What if they were humanity's answer to 300 years of genocide? The thought sent ice through Xenos' veins as he realized the full scope of their situation. If these shadow entities were indeed human in origin, then every military doctrine in the galactic databases was worse than useless. Humans didn't think like other species. They didn't follow conventional tactical or strategic patterns. They were unpredictable, adaptive, and absolutely ruthless when backed into a corner. And the galaxy had backed them into the ultimate corner 3 centuries ago. "Sir!" HFY called from her station, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "We're receiving a transmission. It's coming from inside the shadow field, consuming Kepler 442. Put it through." The bridge speakers crackled with static before a voice emerged. A voice speaking in perfect galactic standard, but with an accent that hadn't been heard in civilized space for 300 years. "Attention. Galactic Council Forces. This is Colonel Sarah Chen of the Terran Marine Corps, Interdimensional Warfare Division. We are responding to your distress calls. The bridge fell completely silent.
Even the background hum of the ship's systems seemed to quiet as every being present tried to process what they had just heard. The voice continued, calm and professional.
We understand you are experiencing difficulties with hostile entities in your space.
Terran forces are moving to assist. Please maintain your current positions and await further instructions. Zefkar found his voice after several long moments. This is Admiral Zefkar of the Vorthak hegemony. Identify yourself properly. Humans were eliminated from this galaxy centuries ago. A pause, then what might have been the sound of quiet laughter. Admiral, with respect, reports of our extinction have been greatly exaggerated. We've been busy during our absence. We've learned some interesting things about the nature of reality itself. What do you want? Zefkar demanded, his training warring with the growing dread in his chest. What we've always wanted, Admiral. To protect innocent life from those who would destroy it. The entities currently consuming your worlds are not of human origin. They are something far older and far more dangerous. We've been hunting them through dimensions for the past 50 years. Another pause. Then the voice took on a harder edge. The question now is whether you're going to accept our help, or whether you're going to let your pride doom what remains of galactic civilization. Zefkar looked around his bridge at the faces of his crew, beings who had never known true fear until these past few days. The irony was not lost on him that the species they had tried to exterminate might now be their only hope for survival. But as he opened his mouth to respond, alarms began screaming throughout the ship. The lights dimmed as something massive passed between their fleet and the nearest star, casting impossible shadows across space itself. Admiral, his sensor operator called out, terror clear in his voice. Something's coming through subspace directly toward our position. It's bigger than a moon. Through the viewports they could see it now, a writhing mass of absolute darkness that seemed to bend light around itself as it approached. Inside that darkness, shapes moved with predatory intent. Colonel Chen, Zefkar spoke into his communicator, pride warring with desperation. We need your help. The response came immediately, and for the first time, there was warmth in the human voice. Help is already on the way, Admiral. Terran Marines don't abandon people in need. Just keep your ship steady and trust us to do our job. As the shadow entity closed in on their position, Zefkar wondered what 300 years of exile and evolution had turned humanity into. In minutes, he would have his answer. And somehow, despite everything his species had done to drive them into the darkness beyond the stars, the humans were coming to save them. The darkness approached like a living thing, consuming starlight and bending space around itself in ways that made Admiral Zefkar's 4 eyes water just to look at it. His fleet's most advanced sensors could barely register its presence, detecting only gravitational distortions and electromagnetic anomalies where something the size of a small moon should have been clearly visible. All weapons systems online, he commanded, knowing even as he spoke that conventional weapons had proven useless against these entities. Maintain defensive formation. Sir, Lieutenant Yexai called from her station, her voice strained with concentration. I'm detecting massive energy signatures within the shadow mass. It's like looking at a star wrapped in dark matter. The entity was less than 10,000 kilometers away now, close enough that its gravitational field was beginning to affect their ship's navigation systems. Zefkar could see smaller shapes detaching from the main mass, predatory forms that moved through vacuum as easily as if it were atmosphere. Colonel Chen, he spoke into his communicator, where are your forces? That thing is almost on top of us. Static filled the channel for several seconds before the human voice returned, now crisp and businesslike. Terran Marines are in position, Admiral. You might want to dim your bridge lights and adjust your optical sensors to maximum sensitivity. We operate a bit differently than you're used to. Before Zefkar could ask what that meant, every light on the bridge suddenly flickered and dimmed to emergency levels. His crew looked around in confusion as their ship's power systems fluctuated wildly. Sir, his chief engineer reported, something's interfacing with our power grid. I'm reading massive energy draws across all decks, but I can't identify the source. Then the fog began to appear. It started as wisps of silvery mist seeping from the ventilation systems, but within moments it had filled the entire bridge. Zefkar felt his secondary breathing apertures close instinctively as the strange vapor surrounded them. It wasn't unpleasant. In fact, it carried a faint scent of ozone and something metallic. But it was completely unlike anything he had ever encountered. What is this? Yexai whispered, reaching out to touch the swirling mist with one clawed hand. Where her fingers made contact, the fog seemed to ripple and flow like liquid mercury. Through the bridge's main view screen, they could see the same phenomenon occurring throughout their fleet. Every ship was being enveloped in the mysterious fog, their hulls disappearing into shifting banks of silver-white mist.
Colonel Chen, Zefkar tried again. What's happening to our ships? Cloaking protocol, Admiral. The entities you're facing exist partially outside normal space-time.
Standard defensive measures are less than useless against them. As if to demonstrate the Colonel's point, the approaching shadow entity suddenly slowed its advance. The predatory shapes that had been racing toward the fleet began circling at a distance, apparently confused by the sudden disappearance of their targets. How is this possible? Zefkar breathed, watching as the massive dark entity turned in space, searching for prey that was hiding in plain sight. 300 years is a long time to spend learning new tricks, came the reply.
We've had some very good teachers. The fog around the bridge began to thicken, and suddenly Zefkar could see shapes moving within it. At first he thought there might be his own crew members, but these figures were wrong somehow. Too tall, too fluid in their movements, carrying equipment that seemed to shift and flow like the mist itself.
Contact, one of his sensor operators announced, his voice barely above a whisper. Multiple humanoid signatures materializing throughout the fleet.
Sir, they're appearing inside our ships. Zefkar's military training warred with the impossible nature of what he was witnessing.
Nothing could teleport through their shields and hull plating. Their defensive grids were designed to prevent exactly this kind of infiltration.
But as he watched, a figure began to solidify from the fog directly in front of him. It was definitely humanoid, roughly 2 meters tall, but wearing what appeared to be armor made of the same shifting, mercury-like substance as the fog itself. The figure's helmet was a smooth, featureless oval that reflected their bridge lights in impossible ways. Admiral Zefkar, the figure spoke, and he recognized Colonel Chen's voice despite the electronic modulation.
Permission to come aboard? Zefkar found himself staring at what was unmistakably a human being, the first he had seen in 3 centuries. But this was not the primitive, barely spacefaring species that the galaxy had driven into exile. This human moved with predatory grace, her equipment seeming to respond to her thoughts rather than manual controls. Most unsettling of all, she appeared to be existing in the same space as the fog without being affected by it.
How? Was all he managed to say. Colonel Chen's helmet retracted, flowing backward like liquid metal to reveal a human face. She appeared to be in her 30s by human standards, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold depths of experience far beyond her apparent age. But what struck Zefkar most was the complete lack of hostility in her expression. Despite everything his species had done to hers, she looked at him with something approaching kindness. Dimensional phase technology, she explained simply. We learned it from our neighbors beyond the galactic rim. Turns out the universe is a much bigger and stranger place than the Council ever imagined. She gestured toward the view screen, where the shadow entity was still circling in apparent confusion. Those things you've been fighting? They're called Devourers. They exist primarily in what humans call the shadow dimension, a layer of reality that overlaps with normal space, but operates by different physical laws. Your conventional weapons can't touch them because you're essentially shooting at their shadows. And you can fight them? Chen's smile was grim but confident. We've been fighting them for 50 years, Admiral. We've gotten very good at it. As if summoned by her words, more figures began emerging from the fog throughout the bridge. Zefkar counted at least a dozen humans, all wearing the same adaptive armor, all carrying weapons that seemed to shift and reconfigure themselves as he watched. His crew stood frozen, unsure whether they were witnessing a rescue or an invasion. The Devourers were drawn to this galaxy by the massive energy expenditure during your war against us. Chen continued, her voice taking on a harder edge. 300 years of orbital bombardments, planet-cracking weapons, and antimatter explosions created a beacon that attracted them from across dimensional barriers. In a very real sense, your attempt to genocide humanity is what brought this threat to your doorstep. Zefkar felt his full stomachs clench with the implications. You're saying this is our fault? I'm saying actions have consequences, Chen replied. But blame can wait until after we've saved your people. She turned toward the view screen and spoke into what appeared to be a communication device integrated into her armor. Strike Team Alpha, you are cleared for phase insertion. Target the primary mass. Strike Team Beta, move to intercept the peripheral hunters. Remember, these are juveniles. Expect standard devourer tactics.
Juveniles? Yekshai whispered. Chen nodded grimly. The adult forms are roughly the size of gas giants. What you've been fighting are essentially their offspring, sent ahead to soften up your defenses. Through the fog-shrouded view screen, they could see something incredible happening. The space around the shadow entity began to ripple and distort, as if reality itself was being folded and twisted. Then, without warning, shapes began emerging from nowhere. Sleek, predatory forms that moved through vacuum with impossible grace. Terran marine assault craft, Chen explained, noting their stares. Designed to operate in multiple dimensions simultaneously, watch and learn how humans fight when they've had 3 centuries to perfect their methods. The human ships, if they could even be called ships, flowed through space like living things. They didn't follow conventional physics, appearing and disappearing at will, attacking from angles that shouldn't have existed. Their weapons seemed to reach through dimensional barriers, striking directly at the shadow entity's core. For the first time since the crisis began, the Devourer reacted with something other than predatory confidence. It writhed and twisted as the human attacks found their mark, its shadowy form flickering between dimensions as it tried to escape the assault. How? Zefkar breathed, watching as his species' greatest nightmare was systematically dismantled by beings he had thought extinct. We learned from the best teachers in the universe. Chen replied, when you drove us beyond the galactic rim, we didn't find empty space. We found civilizations that have been fighting interdimensional predators for millions of years. They taught us that survival isn't about having the biggest guns or the strongest shields. She gestured toward the battle raging outside their ships. Survival is about adaptation. About becoming something your enemies can't predict or counter. About turning your greatest weaknesses into your greatest strengths. The shadow entity was beginning to retreat now, its smaller hunting forms fleeing back toward the main mass as human forces pressed their attack. But Chen showed no sign of satisfaction. If anything, her expression grew more concerned. This was just a scout, she announced. The real threat is still coming. What do you mean? Zefkar demanded. The Devourers don't hunt alone, Admiral. What you've been fighting for the past week is the equivalent of a pack of wolves testing your defenses. Now that they know you're helpless against them, they'll summon the rest of their kind. She activated a holographic display that showed a 3-dimensional map of the local galactic region. Red markers indicated the locations of destroyed worlds, while blue markers showed surviving population centers. But what drew Zefkar's attention was the massive dark area at the edge of the display, a region of space that appeared completely empty. Long-range sensors detected this anomaly forming 3 days ago, Chen explained. It's a dimensional breach roughly the size of your solar system. Something very large is coming through. How large? Yexai asked, her voice barely audible. Chen's expression was grim. Our best estimates suggest it's approximately the mass of a brown dwarf star. An adult devourer, possibly a matriarch. If it fully manifests in this dimension, it will consume everything within 100 light years. The bridge fell silent as the implications sank in. Even if they could somehow defeat the smaller entities, the approaching threat was beyond anything their civilization had ever faced. But you can stop it, Zefkar said, more as a plea than a statement. Chen studied him for a long moment before responding. We can try, but we'll need your help, Admiral. All of your help. Every surviving ship, every available resource, every tactical database your species possesses. You want us to fight alongside you after what we did to your people? Colonel Chen's expression softened slightly. Admiral, when the Devourers are finished with this galaxy, there won't be anyone left to remember old grudges. Right now, the only thing that matters is survival, not just for your species or mine, but for every form of life in this region of space. She extended her hand in the ancient human gesture of alliance. The question is whether you're willing to trust the people you try to exterminate to save your civilization. Zefkar looked at the offered hand, then at his crew, then at the view screen where human forces were still engaged in hunting down the fleeing shadow entities. In 3 centuries of military service, he had never faced a decision with such far-reaching consequences. But as he reached out and grasped Chen's hand, he realized that perhaps some things were more important than pride, more valuable than ancient prejudices. What do you need us to do, Colonel? Colonel Chen's tactical briefing took place in what had once been the Vorthak hegemony's most secure conference room aboard Admiral Zefkar's flagship. Now, the chamber was filled with an impossible mixture of beings. Vorthak military commanders with their chitinous armor and multiple eyes, graceful Quellian officers whose crystalline bodies refracted the room's lights in prismatic patterns, hulking Mordani trade captains who had survived their homeworld's destruction,
and scattered representatives from a dozen other species. But it was the humans who commanded everyone's attention. They moved through the fog-shrouded room like ghosts, their adaptive armor shifting and flowing to accommodate different atmospheric mixtures and gravitational fields. Chen had brought a full command staff, and each one carried themselves with the quiet confidence of beings who had spent centuries learning to fight impossible odds. "Let me be clear about what we're facing," Chen began, activating a holographic display that showed the approaching dimensional anomaly. The image was terrifying in its scope, a tear in reality itself, growing larger every hour. This isn't just another devourer. This is something the interdimensional civilizations beyond the rim call a matriarch. Think of it as the ultimate apex predator, evolved specifically to consume entire galactic civilizations. Admiral Zefkar studied the display with growing horror. His species had ruled this sector for millennia, had defeated every military challenge they had ever faced. But this was something beyond conventional warfare. "How do we fight something like that?" asked Commander Yilsef of the Quellian Collective, her crystalline voice carrying harmonics of barely controlled fear. Chen gestured, and the hologram shifted to show a complex three-dimensional tactical diagram. "We don't fight it directly, not at first. The matriarch exists primarily in the shadow dimension, but it needs anchor points in normal space to fully manifest. It will send out tendrils, smaller entities that establish dimensional bridges." She highlighted several points on the display where bright red markers pulsed ominously. "These are the projected anchor sites. If the matriarch successfully establishes even 3 of them, it will be able to pull its entire mass into our reality. At that point, nothing we have can stop it. So we destroy the anchor points," Zevkar concluded. "Exactly. But there's a complication." Chen's expression grew darker. "The anchor points won't be in empty space. The matriarch will choose locations with maximum dimensional stability. Planets with large populations, space stations, major installations. Anywhere the barrier between dimensions is already thin due to high concentrations of sapient thought and emotion." The implications hit the assembled commanders like a physical blow. Captain Thrix of the Mordani Trade Consortium spoke first. "You're saying it will use our own people as bait?" "Worse than that," replied Major Harrison, one of Chen's subordinates. He was a lean man with prematurely grey hair and eyes that held depths of experience that made even the oldest aliens in the room feel young. "It will use your people as fuel. Every sapient mind at an anchor point becomes part of the matriarch's consciousness. Their fear, their desperation, their life force, all of it feeds into making the dimensional breach stronger." Lieutenant Yexhai, who had been quietly recording everything, looked up with a question that cut straight to the heart of their dilemma. "How many people are we talking about losing?" Chen consulted her tactical display. "Conservative estimates suggest 7 billion souls across 12 worlds if the matriarch achieves full manifestation. Worst case scenario." She paused, her expression showing the weight of command. "Worst case, we're looking at the extinction of every advanced civilization in this galactic arm." The conference room fell silent except for the soft hum of life support systems and the occasional crackle of interdimensional interference from the approaching threat. Each species' representative sat with their own thoughts, trying to process the scope of what they faced. Finally, Admiral Zefkar spoke. "What's your plan, Colonel?" Chen activated a new section of the tactical display, showing detailed schematics of human technology that looked like nothing any of them had ever seen. Ships that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, weapons that fired through layers of reality, armor that could phase between solid matter and pure energy. "The Terran Marine Corps has been developing interdimensional warfare doctrine for the past century," she explained. "We can operate in the shadow dimension, but only for limited periods and with significant support infrastructure. What we need from you is conventional fleet support to cover our insertion points while we work to destabilize the anchor sites." "And then?" asked Commander Yilseth. Major Harrison stepped forward, his expression grim. "Then we do something that's never been attempted before. We'll use your fleet's combined energy output to create a dimensional feedback loop through the anchor points. If we can synchronize the resonance frequencies correctly, we can turn the matriarch's own power against it." "And if we can't synchronize the frequencies?" Zefkar asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Then the dimensional backlash will tear apart everything within 50 light years," Chen replied with brutal honesty. "Including us." Captain Thrix leaned back in his chair. his species equivalent of a bitter laugh rumbling from his massive chest. So our choices are certain extinction or probable extinction. Those are the options, Chen confirmed. But I'll tell you what I told my own people when we first encountered the Devourers. Sometimes the best you can do is choose how you go down fighting. She stood and moved to the room's main view screen, which showed the current disposition of their combined fleet. Hundreds of ships from dozens of different species, all united by necessity against a threat that none of them could face alone. 300 years ago, your governments decided that humanity was too dangerous to exist alongside other sapient species. You drove us beyond the galactic rim, destroyed our colonies, scattered our people to the furthest reaches of known space. Her voice carried no anger, just a statement of historical fact. But what you didn't understand then, what most species never understand, is that humans don't just adapt to survive, we adapt to excel. She turned back to face the assembled commanders. When you forced us into the darkness between dimensions, we didn't just learn to survive there. We learned to thrive. We made alliances with civilizations that existed before your stars were born. We studied forms of physics that most species can't even conceptualize. We became something more than what we were. Chen's armor began to shift and flow, becoming translucent and showing glimpses of the technology beneath. Every human in this fleet has spent at least 50 years learning to fight in environments where the laws of physics are more like suggestions. We've developed weapons that can kill concepts, armor that exists in 7 dimensions simultaneously, ships that can travel through time as easily as through space. The alien commander stared at her with a mixture of awe and terror as she continued. But all of that technology, all of that knowledge, all of that power, it means nothing if there's no one left to protect. That's why we're here. That's why we answered your distress calls instead of letting the Devourers finish what your government started. Admiral Zefkar found himself speaking almost without conscious thought. You could have left us to die. After everything we did to your people, you would have been justified in letting us face this threat alone. Chen's smile was sad but genuine. Admiral, that's exactly the kind of thinking that attracted the Devourers in the first place. Genocide, destruction, the willingness to sacrifice entire civilizations for short-term advantage. That's what tears holes in the dimensional barriers. That's what lets things like the Matriarch smell fear across the void and come hunting. She activated one final display, showing not battle plans or weapon specifications, but images of life throughout the galaxy. Children of a dozen species playing in parks that would soon be anchor points, scientists working to unlock the secrets of the universe, artists creating beauty that transcended species boundaries. We're not fighting just to stop the Matriarch, Chen continued. We're fighting to prove that sapient life can be more than just another resource to be consumed. We're fighting to show the universe that intelligence and compassion can triumph over hunger and destruction. Major Harrison stepped up beside his commander. The plan will require perfect coordination between every ship in our combined fleet. Your people will need to trust our tactical assessments completely, even when they don't make sense according to conventional physics. What are you asking of us? Commander Yilseth inquired. Everything, Chen replied simply. Your ships, your crews, your complete faith in methods that violate every military doctrine you've ever learned. Some of you won't survive the battle. Some of your worlds will be lost before we can save them. But if we succeed, if we can close the dimensional breach and send the Matriarch back to whatever hell spawned it, then every species in this galaxy will have a chance to build something better than what came before. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of every commander present. I need to know right now, are you with us? The silence stretched for long moments before Admiral Zefkar stood from his chair. Colonel Chen, 3 centuries ago, my people made the worst mistake in our species' history. We let fear and prejudice blind us to the value of human civilization. We destroyed something irreplaceable and drove the survivors into exile. He moved to stand beside her, his 4 eyes reflecting the holographic displays. If you're willing to forgive that mistake, if you're willing to trust us despite our past actions, then yes, we're with you. All the way. One by one, the other commanders rose and voiced their agreement. Commander Yilseth's crystalline voice rang with harmonics of determination. Captain Thrix's deep rumble carried the weight of his species' commitment. Even the smaller species representatives, beings whose civilizations hung in the balance, pledged their support. As the meeting dissolved into tactical planning sessions and equipment coordination briefings, Chen found herself standing alone with Admiral Zefkar by the main view screen. Through the fog that still shrouded their ships, they could see the distant glow of the dimensional breach,
growing larger and more ominous with each passing hour.
Colonel, Zefkar said quietly, can I ask you a personal question? Of course, Admiral. When you first made contact with us, when you heard our distress calls, was there ever a moment when you considered leaving us to face this alone? Chen was quiet for so long that Zefkar began to think she wouldn't answer. Finally, she spoke. Yes.
There was. When we first detected the Devourer incursions in this galaxy, our command council debated for 3 days about whether to respond. A lot of my people felt that this was justice, that perhaps the galaxy needed to learn the consequences of genocide the hard way. What changed your mind? Chen smiled sadly. My daughter asked me a question. She's 16, born and raised in interdimensional space, never seen a planet until we arrived here. She asked me what the point of surviving 3 centuries of exile would be if we became the kind of people who could watch billions die and do nothing to stop it. She gestured toward the approaching threat. The matriarch feeds on fear, hatred, and the willingness to sacrifice others for personal survival. If we had chosen revenge over rescue, we would have become exactly what it was hunting for. We would have made ourselves part of the problem instead of part of the solution. Admiral Zefkar nodded slowly, understanding something about humanity that his species had missed 3 centuries ago. You didn't come back to prove you were stronger than us. No, Chen agreed. We came back to prove that we could all be stronger together. As if summoned by their conversation, alarms began sounding throughout the ship. The dimensional breach had suddenly expanded, and long-range sensors were detecting massive energy signatures moving through the shadow dimension toward their location. All hands to battle stations, Chen announced calmly. The real war is about to begin. The first anchor point materialized around Kepler 186, a heavily populated Quellian research world with over 2 billion crystalline inhabitants. Admiral Zefkar watched in horror as the space surrounding the planet began to fold inward on itself, reality warping like heated metal as something vast and hungry pressed against the dimensional barriers from the other side. Dimensional resonance achieving critical frequency, reported Lieutenant Yexai, her voice tight with controlled panic. The barrier is failing. Through the tactical display, they could see tendrils of absolute darkness reaching through the growing breach, touching the planet's surface with predatory delicacy. Where they made contact, entire cities simply ceased to exist, not destroyed, not vaporized, but erased from reality as if they had never been built. Colonel Chen, Zefkar spoke into his communicator. The first anchor point is stabilizing. We're losing Kepler 186. Chen's reply came through channels heavy with interdimensional interference. Understood, Admiral. Terran Strike Force Gamma is moving to intercept. Begin the fleet maneuver we discussed. What followed was unlike anything in the military doctrine of any known species. The combined galactic fleet began to move in patterns that defied conventional three-dimensional thinking, ships appearing and disappearing as they phased through dimensional barriers under human guidance. Zefkar's flagship found itself flying through space that existed in multiple realities simultaneously, its instruments showing readings that shouldn't have been possible. Sir, his chief engineer called from across the bridge. Human technicians are interfacing directly with our power core. They're modifying our shield generators to emit some kind of dimensional frequency. Through the fog that still enveloped his bridge, Zefkar could see the human specialists at work. They moved with practiced efficiency, their adaptive equipment seeming to merge seamlessly with Vorthak technology, despite being built according to completely different principles. What struck him most was how they worked, not as conquerors imposing their will, but as partners adapting to each species' unique capabilities. Phase insertion in 30 seconds, Major Harrison announced from his position at a console that seemed to exist partially outside normal space. All fleet units prepare for dimensional shift. Suddenly, the stars outside the viewports began to shift and blur, as their entire fleet transitioned into what the humans called the shadow dimension. Zefkar felt his 4 stomachs clench as reality became fluid around them, the familiar laws of physics replaced by something far more mutable and dangerous. They were no longer flying through empty space, but through something that resembled the inside of a living thing. Pulsing walls of dark energy that contracted and expanded with rhythms that matched no natural heartbeat. In the distance, massive shapes moved with predatory intent, and Zefkar realized they were seeing the Devourers in their natural environment. Target acquired. Chen's voice came through their communications, clearer now that they were operating in the same dimensional layer as the human forces. Terran Marines are engaging the anchor point stabilizers. Through the tactical display, they could watch the human assault unfold. Marines in their adaptive armor moved through the shadow dimension like they were born there,
flowing between layers of reality to attack weak points in the Matriarch's dimensional constructs. Their weapons fired rounds that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, capable of damaging enemies that normal matter couldn't even touch. But the Devourers weren't passive targets. As the humans pressed their attack, the smaller entities that served as the Matriarch's scouts began to converge on their position. These creatures were nightmares given form, shape-shifting masses of hungry darkness that could exist in 7 dimensions at once, armed with weapons that fired concentrated entropy and despair. "Fleet formation, Omega," Chen commanded, and suddenly every ship in their combined force began moving in perfect synchronization. Vorthak heavy cruisers provided covering fire, while Quellian energy ships created dimensional barriers to channel the enemy's movements. Mordani cargo haulers, hastily converted into munitions platforms, launched volleys of conventional warheads that had been modified with human technology to affect Shadow Dimension targets.
"It's working," Yexhai reported with something approaching hope in her voice.
The anchor point is destabilizing. But even as they celebrated this small victory, Zefkar could see 2 more breaches opening in distant star systems. The Matriarch was adapting to their tactics, spreading its efforts across multiple locations simultaneously.
"Sir," his communications officer called out, "we're receiving reports from Hegemony Command. The second anchor point has appeared around Vega."
3 billion Mordani civilians are trapped on the planet's surface. Chen's response was immediate. "Strike Force Beta, redirect to Vega." 7. "Admiral Zefkar, we need your heavy units to provide orbital bombardment support." "Orbital bombardment?" Zefkar questioned. "Against our own people, not against your people." Major Harrison clarified, his voice grim. "Against the anchor points themselves. The Matriarch is using your civilians' fear and desperation to strengthen the dimensional breach. We need to disrupt that process before it reaches critical mass." The tactical situation was becoming increasingly desperate. For every anchor point they closed, the Matriarch opened 2 more. Entire worlds were being consumed while their combined fleet raced between crisis points, always one step behind the enemy's expanding strategy. "Colonel," Zefkar found himself asking during a brief lull in the battle, "how many of these things have you fought before?" "Matriarchs? This is our first." Chen's admission sent ice through his veins. "We've engaged adult Devourers, but never anything of this scale. Most interdimensional civilizations don't even try to fight them. They just run." "Then how do you know this plan will work?" Chen was quiet for a moment before answering. "We don't. But we've learned something about fighting impossible odds over the past 3 centuries, Admiral. Sometimes the only way to win is to attempt something so unprecedented, so completely outside your enemy's experience, that they can't adapt fast enough to counter it." As if to demonstrate her point, the tactical display suddenly showed something that made every being on the bridge stare in amazement. The third anchor point, which had been steadily growing around the Keelian homeworld, suddenly began to collapse in on itself. But instead of the controlled destabilization they had achieved at the previous sites, this one was imploding with violent force. "What did you do?" Commander Yilset's voice came through their communications, her crystalline tones carrying harmonics of awe and terror. "We reversed the polarity of the dimensional breach," replied Captain Martinez, the leader of Strike Force Alpha. "Instead of allowing the Matriarch to pull our reality into the Shadow Dimension, we're pushing Shadow Dimension energy back through the breach." The results were spectacular and terrifying. The anchor point collapsed with such force that it created a dimensional shockwave, sending ripples through both layers of reality. The Matriarch's response was immediate and furious, a roar of rage that seemed to come from everywhere at once, causing structural damage to ships in both dimensions. "It worked," Yekshai breathed, staring at the readings on her console. "The anchor point is gone and the dimensional breach is actually shrinking." But their celebration was short-lived. The tactical display suddenly lit up with new contacts as the Matriarch abandoned subtlety in favor of overwhelming force. Instead of trying to establish anchor points gradually, it began tearing holes in reality directly, preparing to manifest its full form regardless of the dimensional instability that would result. "All units, emergency maneuvers," Chen commanded as space around them began to buckle and warp. "It's coming through." Through the viewports, they could see something that defied comprehension. A mass of living darkness larger than most moons, pressing against the barriers between dimensions with such force that reality itself began to crack. Where it touched normal space, stars went out, not destroyed, but simply ceasing to exist as the Matriarch's presence consumed the very concept of light. "Fleet status report," Zefkar called out, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what they faced. 70% of our force is still operational, his tactical officer reported. But sir, our conventional weapons can't even touch something that size. Chen's voice cut through their communications with calm authority. All units, prepare for final gambit. We're going to try something that's never been attempted before. A dimensional inversion cascade using every ship in our combined fleet as resonance amplifiers. What does that mean? Captain Thrix demanded. It means we're going to turn every power core in our fleet into a dimensional weapon, Major Harrison explained. If we can create a synchronized energy pulse at exactly the right frequency, we can force the matriarch back into the shadow dimension and seal the breach behind it.
And if we can't achieve synchronization?
Zefkar asked. Then the dimensional backlash will destroy everything within 100 light years, Chen replied with characteristic honesty, including us. The matriarch was almost fully manifested now, its presence causing gravitational distortions that made normal flight impossible. Ships throughout the fleet were reporting system failures as reality became increasingly unstable around them. Human technicians are taking control of all fleet power systems, HFY reported. Sir, they're asking us to surrender complete operational authority to their command network. This was it, the moment of ultimate trust. After 3 centuries of enmity, after driving humanity to the brink of extinction, they were being asked to place their entire civilization's survival in human hands. Zefkar looked around his bridge at the faces of his crew, beings who had never known defeat until these past few days, soldiers who had built their careers on the assumption of Vorthak's superiority. But in their eyes, he saw something that perhaps hadn't existed since the Great Purge 3 centuries ago. Hope. Do it, he commanded. Transfer all operational control to Colonel Chen. Across the fleet, similar decisions were being made as representatives of dozens of species chose trust over fear, cooperation over isolation. One by one, their ship's power signatures began to synchronize under human coordination. Dimensional inversion cascade in 60 seconds, Chen announced. All non-essential personnel to emergency stations. If this works, we're going to experience forces that most physics textbooks would consider impossible. Through the fog-shrouded viewports, they could see the matriarch's full form now. A living embodiment of hunger and darkness that dwarfed entire star systems. Its presence was causing reality itself to unravel, creating impossible geometries where parallel lines intersected and time flowed in multiple directions simultaneously. 30 seconds to cascade initiation, Major Harrison called out. Fleet synchronization at 97% and climbing. Zefkar found himself thinking about his species' history, about the decision 3 centuries ago to drive humanity into exile rather than learn to coexist with them. How different things might have been if they had chosen cooperation over fear, trust over suspicion. 10 seconds to cascade initiation. All units, prepare for dimensional inversion. The countdown reached 0, and reality exploded around them. The dimensional inversion cascade began as a whisper of energy that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Admiral Zefkar felt it in his bones first, a harmonic resonance that made his 4 hearts skip beats and caused his chitinous exoskeleton to vibrate at frequencies that shouldn't have been possible. Around his bridge, every piece of equipment began to glow with an ethereal light, as human-modified power systems channeled energy through pathways that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Fleet synchronization at 100%, Major Harrison announced, his voice cutting through the building energy storm. Dimensional cascade is achieving critical resonance. Through the viewports, the effect was visible as waves of impossible color that rippled through space itself. The combined power output of hundreds of ships from dozens of different species, all coordinated through human technology that treated the laws of physics more like suggestions than absolute rules. The matriarch's response was immediate and violent. The massive entity which had been pressing through the dimensional barrier with inexorable force suddenly recoiled as if struck by something it hadn't expected. Its roar of rage and confusion echoed through both layers of reality, causing structural damage to ships and installations across 3 star systems. It's working, Lieutenant Yexhey reported, her voice filled with amazement as she watched her instruments register impossible readings. The dimensional breach is contracting. We're actually pushing it back. But the battle was far from over. As the cascade effect intensified, the matriarch began to adapt its strategy. Instead of trying to force its way through the barriers between dimensions, it started to fragment itself, breaking off pieces of its consciousness and hurling them through the cascade field like living missiles. Multiple contacts incoming. Chen's voice came through their communications, still calm despite the chaos erupting around them. Shadow fragments, highly aggressive. All units, defensive formation Epsilon.
What followed was unlike anything in recorded military history. Ships that existed partially in normal space and partially in the shadow dimension fought against enemies that were pure concentrated malevolence given form.
The human Marines moved through the battle like supernatural beings, their adaptive armor allowing them to phase between realities mid-combat, striking at shadow fragments from angles that shouldn't have existed. Zefkar watched in fascination and terror as one of his own heavy cruisers, modified with human dimensional technology, engaged a shadow fragment the size of a small asteroid. The Vorthak crew fought with conventional weapons while human technicians guided their ship through impossible maneuvers, appearing behind the enemy one moment and phasing through its core the next. "Admiral!" Chen's voice cut through the tactical chaos. "We need you to do something that goes against every instinct your species has." "What do you need?" "Turn off your shields." The request hit Zefkar like a physical blow. In 40 years of military service, through dozens of conflicts and countless training exercises, the one absolute rule had been to maintain defensive systems at all costs. "Colonel, that's suicide. Not with our modifications," she explained quickly. "Your shield generators are now resonance amplifiers for the dimensional cascade, but they can only function at full efficiency if they're not simultaneously trying to maintain defensive barriers. We need every ship in the fleet to drop shields simultaneously." Through his tactical display, Zefkar could see similar conversations happening throughout the fleet. Commanders from every species wrestling with the same impossible decision: trust the humans completely, or maintain the defensive doctrines that had kept their civilizations alive for millennia. Sir Yexhai whispered, "If we're wrong about this, if their modifications fail, we'll be completely defenseless." Zefkar looked around his bridge at the faces of his crew, then at the human technicians who were working alongside them with complete dedication. These were the people his government had tried to genocide, the survivors his species had driven into the darkness between dimensions. And now they were risking everything to save worlds full of beings who had once been their enemies. "All hegemony ships drop shields on my mark," he announced into his fleet communications. Mark. Across the combined fleet, hundreds of ships simultaneously dropped their defensive barriers and became pure conduits for the dimensional cascade. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Space around them began to glow with energy patterns that existed in colors the optical spectrum couldn't contain. The matriarch's scream of rage became something else: surprise, then what might have been fear. The massive entity had spent eons consuming civilizations that fought according to predictable patterns, but this coordination between former enemies, this willingness to trust completely in the face of annihilation, was something outside its experience. "Dimensional breach collapsing," reported Major Harrison. "The matriarch is being pulled back into the shadow dimension." But the ancient predator wasn't finished. As it was forced back through the barriers between realities, it began to collapse its remaining fragments into a single, concentrated attack. All of its remaining consciousness, all of its accumulated hunger and malevolence, focused into one final assault directed straight at the heart of their formation. "Massive energy spike incoming," Yexhai called out, her voice tight with alarm. "Sir, it's targeting our command ship directly." Zefkar felt time slow as he processed what was happening. The matriarch had identified him as the fleet commander and was preparing to decapitate their entire operation with one devastating strike. Without shields, his flagship would be completely defenseless. But even as he opened his mouth to order evasive maneuvers, something impossible happened. The fog that had enveloped their ships throughout the battle suddenly solidified into a barrier of pure energy between his flagship and the incoming attack. Human ships materialized from nowhere, their crews deliberately interposing themselves between the command vessel and certain destruction. "Terran Marines don't abandon their allies," Chen's voice came through the communications, steady despite the fact that her ship was taking the full brunt of the matriarch's final attack. "Complete the cascade, Admiral. Send this thing back where it came from." The dimensional inversion reached critical mass as hundreds of ships channeled their combined power through pathways that connected multiple layers of reality. Space itself began to turn inside out as the cascade effect created a feedback loop that pulled the matriarch inexorably back through the dimensional breach. But the cost was becoming clear. Human ships throughout the fleet were taking catastrophic damage as they absorbed attacks meant for their alien allies. On his tactical display, Zefkar watched as vessel after vessel disappeared from the formation, their crews making the ultimate sacrifice to protect people whose governments had once declared them enemies. "The breach is sealing," Harrison reported. his voice carrying exhaustion and grief in equal measure. The matriarch is gone, but the dimensional backlash is going to be massive. All units, emergency jump to minimum safe distance. Chen commanded, though her own ship was clearly too damaged to comply.
Execute immediately. As ships throughout the fleet began their emergency retreats, Zefkar made a decision that would define his species' relationship with humanity for generations to come. Instead of fleeing to safety, he ordered his flagship to move closer to the collapsing dimensional breach.
"Sir, what are you doing?" Yaxhai demanded. "Colonel Chan's ship is too damaged to reach minimum safe distance," he explained, working his console with practiced efficiency. "We're going to give them a tow." "Admiral, that's madness. The dimensional backlash could destroy both our ships." Zefkar looked at her with 4 eyes that held absolute certainty. "Lieutenant, 3 centuries ago my people made a decision based on fear and prejudice that nearly doomed our entire galaxy. I will not make that mistake again." His flagship's tractor beams locked onto Chen's damaged vessel, just as the dimensional breach began its final collapse. The backlash was everything their worst predictions had suggested. Waves of pure entropy that aged metal by centuries in seconds. Gravitational distortions that turned space itself into a maze of folded geometry. Energy discharges that existed in spectrums no known sensor could properly register. But somehow, through skill and determination, and perhaps simple stubborn refusal to give up, both ships made it to minimum safe distance before the breach sealed itself permanently. The matriarch was gone. Trapped once again in the shadow dimension, with the barriers between realities stronger than they had been in millennia. The aftermath of the battle was both triumphant and sobering. They had saved the galaxy from an extinction-level threat, but the cost had been enormous. 37 human ships had been destroyed in the final engagement, taking with them over 8,000 Marines who had volunteered for the most dangerous mission in recorded history. Admiral Zefkar found himself standing in the same conference room where the alliance had been forged. But now the atmosphere was completely different. Representatives from every surviving species sat in respectful silence as Colonel Chen, her left arm in a medical support brace from injuries sustained during the final battle, delivered her after-action report. "The dimensional barriers have been reinforced by the cascade effect," she explained, her voice steady despite the grief that was evident in her expression. "It should be at least 1,000 years before anything like the matriarch can threaten this galaxy again. Possibly longer if the surviving species work together to maintain the resonance network we've established."
Commander Yilseth spoke first. "Colonel Chen, on behalf of the Quellian Collective, I want to thank you for what your people have done. We owe you a debt that can never be repaid."
Similar statements came from around the room as species after species acknowledged their gratitude, but Chen raised her hand for silence, her expression thoughtful. "With respect, I don't think you understand what really happened here," she said quietly. "Yes, human technology and tactics were crucial to victory. But the real reason we succeeded was because you were willing to trust us. Despite our history, despite 3 centuries of fear and prejudice, when it mattered most, you chose cooperation over conflict." She stood and moved to the room's main view screen, which showed the current disposition of their combined fleet. Human ships worked alongside alien vessels, their crews sharing technology and techniques that would have been unthinkable just days ago. "The matriarch wasn't just drawn to this galaxy by the energy signatures of your wars," Chen continued. "It was drawn by the hate, the willingness to destroy others for perceived survival advantages, the fear that made sapient species see each other as threats instead of allies." Admiral Zefkar found himself understanding something that had been nagging at him throughout the entire crisis. "You're saying that our attitudes, our approach to interspecies relations, that's what made us vulnerable in the first place?"
Exactly. Chen confirmed.
Entities like the matriarch are attracted to civilizations that operate from scarcity thinking, that believe survival is a zero-sum game where someone has to lose for someone else to win. They feed on fear, hatred, and the willingness to sacrifice others for personal advantage. She gestured toward the combined fleet visible through the view screen. "But what we created here, this alliance between former enemies, this willingness to trust completely in the face of annihilation, that's something predators like the matriarch can't understand or counter. It's what allowed us to achieve something that individual species never could have managed alone." Captain Thrix leaned forward in his chair, his massive frame conveying intense interest. "Are you proposing a permanent alliance?" "I'm proposing something that should have happened 3 centuries ago," Chen replied. A true galactic community based on cooperation instead of competition, on shared knowledge instead of hoarded advantages, on the understanding that every sapient species brings something valuable to the table.
Darun fell silent as the implications sank in. What she was describing would require fundamental changes in how every civilization approached interspecies relations. Finally, Admiral Zefkar spoke. Colonel, 300 years ago, the Galactic Council made its greatest mistake when it chose fear over trust. If you're willing to give us a second chance, if humanity is willing to share the knowledge and technology you've developed during your exile, then yes, we're ready to build something better. One by one, the other representatives voiced their agreement. The Quellian Collective offered their research facilities for joint scientific projects. The Mordani Trade Consortium pledged their commercial networks for resource sharing. Even the smaller species, those who had been marginalized in the old galactic order, found their voices and their place in the new alliance being born. As the meeting evolved into detailed planning sessions for the post-war galaxy, Chen found herself standing alone with Zefkar by the main view screen. Through the transparent aluminum, they could see human and alien ships working together to rescue survivors from damaged vessels, to repair battle damage, to begin the long process of rebuilding what had been destroyed.
Colonel, Zefkar said quietly, can I ask you something personal?
Of course, Admiral.
During the battle when your people sacrificed themselves to protect our ships, that wasn't just tactical necessity, was it?
Chen smiled sadly.
No, Admiral.
It wasn't. When you choose to save people instead of seeking revenge, when you put the welfare of former enemies above your own survival, when you prove that intelligence and compassion can triumph over hatred and destruction, that becomes who you are. That becomes what defines your species. She pointed toward a group of human technicians working alongside Vorthak engineers to repair battle damage. Those Marines who died in the final battle. They died proving that humanity had learned something important during our 3 centuries in exile. They died showing the galaxy that we had become something better than what we were when you first drove us away.
Admiral Zefkar nodded slowly, understanding something about humanity that his species had missed 3 centuries ago. You didn't come back for revenge. You came back to become the people you wanted to be. We came back to show the universe that sapient species can choose to be more than just predators competing for resources, Chen confirmed.
We came back to prove that even former enemies can become allies when they're willing to trust each other with everything that matters. As they watched the combined fleet work together in the aftermath of their victory, both of them understood that they were witnessing the birth of something unprecedented in galactic history. Not just a military alliance or a temporary cooperation, but a true community of sapient species, united by the understanding that their greatest strength lay not in their individual capabilities, but in their willingness to stand together against the darkness. The matriarch was gone, but its legacy would be the opposite of what it had intended. Instead of consuming galactic civilization, it had catalyzed the creation of something stronger and more beautiful than anything that had come before. A community of species that had learned to see diversity as strength, cooperation as survival, and trust as the foundation of everything worth protecting in the universe. In the years that followed, historians would mark the Battle of the Shadow Breach as the end of one era and the beginning of another. The old galaxy of competing species and hoarded knowledge gave way to a new age of cooperation and shared discovery. Humanity's exile had ended not with conquest or revenge, but with the fulfillment of their species' greatest dream, a galaxy where all sapient life could thrive together. And in the deepest archives of the new Galactic Alliance, carefully preserved for future generations, was the complete record of how the species that had once begged for rescue learned that sometimes the people you fear most are the ones most capable of saving everything you hold dear.